Let me just start by just giving a little sort of background about myself. I was born in Bradford in West Yorkshire. My parents are Jamaican, but I now live in southwest London. I live in a place called Thursdown. And interestingly enough, I've lived here for 15 years. And when we first moved into the place where we live, the estate agent said this area is Streatham. Interestingly enough, now everyone calls it Thursdown. And I'm actually convinced that this is a ruse cobbled up by estate agents because Thursdown sounds very villagey, more villagey than I would say Streatham. And I think it also means from an estate agent's perspective, it puts an extra £40,000 on your house. I hope there are no estate agents in a building this evening. I don't want to offend anyone. So my current role, as Bishop Carraway mentioned, is at Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, and I'm the Director of Justice and Inclusion. And, I've been asked to speak on the topic of how churches in South London can encourage greater racial diversity in ecumenical settings. And this, for me, is very much about justice and inclusion. I always say that justice and inclusion are like two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And inclusion is actually justice in action. And I think one of the conversations that has come out of the Black Lives Matter movement, and both Chinny and Bishop Carraway have mentioned that this evening, are ones where people have been asking, or almost demanding in some instances, to see tangible change, both in terms of church as well as society, and how both can be more inclusive spaces. I suppose the $64,000 question is, how do we do that? How can we remove the barriers, the glass ceilings and the like that thwart opportunity, advancement and real inclusion? So in terms of sort of ecumenism, because I work for an ecumenical instrument, that's Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, the watchwords for ecumenism are unity, partnership and cooperation. And I think that all these terms are particularly pertinent at this precise moment because of the COVID-19 crisis. And among other issues, this pandemic has created a range of health and economic hardships that I think, sadly, in all likelihood, will probably only get worse. And the pandemic has also presented a number of unique challenges to the church, which it is grappling with. So for me, it doesn't make sense either spiritually or socially for churches not to work together or to fail to include those within the body of Christ for whatever reason. It's a bit like seeking to work with one hand tied behind your back. It just doesn't make sense. And I think, speaking of a pandemic and local sort of ecumenical responses to difficult situations, food banks are one that I would, like to sort of call out and say that, they're doing excellent work. And we know that since the crisis has taken place, they've been inundated. But in all truth, they were busy before the pandemic. All the pandemic has done is exacerbate the situation and it's up the ante in terms of their work. And the food bank where I live does an excellent job. They're meeting the increased needs of local people. From a sort of a racial diversity perspective, I think the work by me is good. There is diversity there in terms of the people who actually volunteer. But if one looks at the profile of those folk, you'll see that most of them are retired. And I think given the times when food banks function and which tends to be during the day, it would be a real challenge to recruit a wider, diverse cohort because most of the Black folks that I know who attend church anyway work during those hours. And those who don't carry out shift work in terms of medical stroke caring professions. So they're not available, due to sleep and other family commitments. I think the greater challenge in terms of widening the cohort of churches that are involved in projects such as food banks would be to kind of get more diverse churches being a part of that And I would argue that, from my perspective, I definitely see a Church of England bias with regard to certain ecumenical responses. And I say that as somebody who actually attends a Church of England church myself. I think, if we're honest, we will admit to the fact that South London is awash with black churches. And, one of the jobs that I did prior to my current one and the job before that at Christian Aid was I worked at City Hall for 9 years. And in that time, I was involved in community engagement. And I know a lot about the growing number of Spanish and Portuguese speaking congregations hailing from Latin America, Brazil, as well as Africa. And I know the importance of churches within these particular communities. And it's also important to note that a good number of those who attend these churches are what the sociologists and the economists would call the working poor. These are the folk who carry out work that tends to be sort of low paid and often low skilled. But these are men and women who are actually overqualified for the work that they carry out. Not enough time to actually explore this particular phenomenon. But I think one of the things we need to know is the fact that when it comes to food banks, an increasing number of people who actually use their services fall within the category of the working poor. So I'm not sure what the average profile is for a food bank user. I'm not sure if they actually have one, but it would be interesting to know what percentage of food bank users are from a Black, Asian, or a minority ethnic background. And I think greater ecumenical engagement in terms of working with Black and Hispanic churches in particular may also mean that food banks are able to engage with a cohort that could really benefit from using their services. And, I mentioned the pandemic just now, and I think it's also created havoc with people's health and well-being, especially mental health. And I remember before the crisis, there were conversations where I live in my particular area, between the historic church denominations about establishing a mental health stroke well-being project. But unbeknownst to them, there was already an excellent one functioning in the area. And this was established by a medical expert linked to a Pentecostal congregation. And I mentioned this, and that particular individual was contacted. And what subsequently came about was a partnership between the historic churches and that particular individual. So it was a case of partnership rather than reinventing the wheel, which I think is always a good thing. Yet the fact that the historic churches weren't aware of this work speaks volumes about the existing void or gulf in terms of ecumenical engagement and encounter. And I also recollect various conversations in my part of southwest London about the possibilities of having night shelters in churches for the homeless and those who are in challenging and difficult sort of situations. And the initial conversations took place again with the historic churches. And then this conversation was actually widened to include evangelical churches. But no overtures were ever extended to Black Pentecostal congregations, even though there are several large ones within the area. Now, one of the biggest complaints from Black congregations is the need to have their own buildings. And having your own building is a sign of permanence. It's also a sign that you've actually arrived as a church or a denomination, and it gives a church an opportunity to develop a range of programs that help it to better engage with local communities. I know this because in 2011, I was asked by the New Testament Assembly, the NTA, to write a history of its 50 years in this country. And, during the course of doing the research for this particular book, I recognized that they purchased their first building in Glen Burnie Road, which is in Tooting Bec, in the 1970s. And then a bit later than that, they bought their current building in Beechcroft Road, which is just around the corner. And then they subsequently followed this up by buying a church in Leighton in East London, where the purchase of these buildings were a real moments of pride for the church. But I'm also minded to consider what Reverend Rose Hudson Wilkin, who is now the Bishop of Dover, once said when asked about Black congregations and buildings. And she said, we shouldn't be buying any more churches. We should be sharing buildings rather than spending the money that we don't have buying them. And I think, there's a fair point to this. And I think personally, I actually hold the two approaches in tension. And in 1971, the British Council of Churches, which was rather the forerunner of my organisation, Church Together in Britain and Ireland, established what was known as the Community and Race Relations Unit. And one of its first pieces of work in 1972 was to set up a working party to explore the use of church properties for community activities in multiracial areas. And this was regarded in 1972 as a controversial issue, even though the initial part of the investigation was about church buildings being used by what was known then as Black-led churches. But in truth, some 48 years later, it's still a controversial issue for a number of reasons. Don't really have time to go into all of that. But, if we are seeking to be true to the original vision of ecumenism, then we need to address this issue with integrity and the seriousness with which it deserves. Now, I mentioned the Community and Race Relations Unit just now, and another aspect of its work was to campaign for racial justice in church and society. Now, the obvious question I would ask about any work to encourage racial diversity is there a place of justice and inclusion in that conversation? And there are some obvious things that we can do to encourage racial diversity in ecumenical spaces. And, CTSL, you're doing some right now, for instance, having activities whenever possible after work during the week, and you avoid doing stuff on weekends. And, while we know that COVID-19 means that more people are able to work from home, what the crisis has shown is that a disproportionate number of Black folks are involved in care work as well as key workers, and they don't have that luxury. And I remember recently taking part in an ecumenical Zoom conversation during the week over lunch. I didn't organize it, but one of the pastors who was on the call was actually hiding away in the staff room at his workplace, while another one was in a colleague's office. And I think sometimes those of us who work for these historic Christian denominations need to give a little more thought to when we schedule meetings. And I think in that respect, the ecumenical family needs to take a leaf out of its, its interfaith cousins' books, because no one serious about interfaith engagement calls a meeting on a Friday. But I think there are some real fundamental issues that need addressing when it comes to ecumenical engagement. For instance, when churches are looking to establish some local ecumenical response to an issue, what considerations are given to racial diversity? Is it uppermost in our thinking, or is it an afterthought? Is it one of those scenarios where a group is assembled and then afterwards they're about to take a photograph, and then, they suddenly realize that there's lots of ethnic homogeneity? And when this happens, what happens? What I've seen is that there's a mad scramble to inject a little color into proceedings. And I would argue that there's something fundamentally wrong with this particular approach. And it reminds me of something that a colleague called the cake analogy, where, we know that sugar is one of the key ingredients if you're making a sponge cake. But if you forget to include it, for whatever reason, you can do a couple of things. You can either slice the cake in two, add some jam, maybe a bit of sweetened cream, and it can be a Victoria sandwich. Or you can add icing or frosting. Now, both would actually sweeten the cake, but they're not a fundamental part of the ingredients, nor are they a fundamental part of the cake. And because they're not, it's easy to actually remove these items. So you can actually scrape off the icing or the frosting, and you can remove the jam if you want to. Now, a real foodie in most instances would actually say, well, the best thing to do in this instance is to throw away the cake and start again. But what we tend to see in organizations, projects and programs and initiatives, and these include church ones, are that when it comes to a lack of racial diversity, we tend to soldier on. We opt for retrofitting and grafting, which can also mean that, the folks who we bring in to an activity at the last moment can also be removed for whatever reason. And I believe that if we're serious about racial justice and inclusion, then any ecumenical activity that seeks to engage with diverse communities but fails to obtain the commensurate buy-in from these diverse communities should seriously consider whether it's appropriate to carry out this work. And I don't think it's sufficient to actually muddle on and make excuses like, well, we tried to contact the local Pentecostal pastor, but he didn't get back to us. I mean, most of us know that Pentecostal pastors tend to work full time and they're not at the office, during working hours. And I believe if you really wanted to engage with some of these folk, then ways could be found to do so. I'm a Church of England person, and I know that bishops are very busy people. And they also have, excellent support staff who can sometimes be gatekeepers to limit access. But, when a vicar or a church leader wants to get hold of them, they'll find ways of doing this. And I think we need to do a similar thing when it comes to engaging with church leaders and pastors. For me, inclusion cannot be a tick box exercise, nor can it be a photo opportunity. Black, Asian, and minority ethnic folks must be a part of a conversation at the outset of an initiative so they can play a role in the planning and the execution of all aspects. And I know of scenarios where Black Christians were selected to represent their church or parachurch group, but they hadn't been properly briefed by either those who nominated them or those who were actually running the forum. And as a result, they couldn't make any form of substantive contribution to that meeting. They sort of sat there as passive bystanders, much to their chagrin. And it's been my experience within various church-related organizations that there's almost this unwritten rule that you never get told how things work. There's no induction, there's no instruction. Somehow you're meant to understand how things work by osmosis. And you get invited to something and you end up asking lots of questions, which can make you feel very self-conscious. And it makes you think that, maybe your peers are thinking, well, this person doesn't know what they're doing. And they're only here because, they need to add a little color to proceedings. When in all truth, in terms of diversity, you're there because you've got particular skills, ideas, and expertise, as well as a unique perspective to bring to matters that can only enhance what is being done. So, finally, what I would say is this, that as I've said, I work for a national ecumenical instrument, and I know the challenges when it comes to churches working together. It's a lot easier said than done. And where I live in Thursdown, there are more churches than pubs, which I always find to be quite novel. And I remember a few years ago having a chat with a non-Christian neighbor about this. And he went on to ask me whether these churches were the religious equivalent of the tabloid and broadsheet newspapers giving their own take on the news. And I remember saying to him that it's not really a great analogy. I said, it's a pretty poor one, to be honest. But what I did say is this, I said, in terms of the news, well, our news in terms of churches is the good news. And unlike newspapers, we're not competing against one another. But I think while we may not be competing against one another, are we really cooperating? Especially if we are excluding our brothers and sisters in Christ from other denominations or failing to affirm those of other ethnicities within our churches. And I just sort of like to leave one question, and that is, whether racial diversity is a forethought or rather an afterthought when it comes to planning ecumenical activities. I'd like to leave it there. Thank you.